SO 209, Study Session 9, Colonial Social Structure of Nigeria. Introduction. In this study session, we will explore the concept of colonial social structure. We will also identify the elements of social structure in colonial Nigeria systems. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to appraise the elements of social structure in colonial Nigeria and describe the development and growth of social welfare systems during the colonial period in Nigeria. The concept of social structure of colonialism in Nigeria. The social structure of a modern society consists of a large number of the social institutions such as the family, education, religion, the group, and so on. Thus, Kornblum, 1997, therefore defined the study of social structure as the description and classification of the principal types of social groups and institutions. This study session will now look at these institutions that make up social structure of Nigeria in colonial period, which is the period of change. Family institution. During the colonial era in Nigeria, the missionary activities and the process of industrialization weakened the extended family system. For instance, the urban environment quickly turned to be less conducive for the effective functioning of the extended family system. To start with, housing in the urban environment was usually very limited, a circumstance which did not permit large compounds of extended family as was in the past. Wages in the urban center in the early 20th century were very low, and with no farmland nearby to supplement his wage, the new urban dweller soon learned that in the collaboration of his meager resources, he came before his extended family. Faniro Odekunle, 1978. Faniro Odekunle stresses the point that during the colonial period, that is, the period of change, the extended family could no longer cope effectively with the problems of economic and social survival, because new problems sprang up within urban centers that the extended family could not have been able to prevent. Examples of such problems were epidemics, overcrowded prisons, unsanitary work conditions, lack of schools and hospitals, high infant and prenatal mortality. In other words, the pace and nature of development were such that new problems were generated, the intensity and complexity of which were beyond the capacity of the extended family system. Pale, 1975, pointed out that the most family change is the great variety of family structures which exist even within a single society. For instance, changes from a traditional system of large, extended, polygamous families living together in perfect harmony with low divorce and illegitimacy, marriage by almost all adults, and absolute control by the elders to a modern system of small, monogamous, nuclear families, high divorce and illegitimacy, many people remaining single in their lives, freedom of individuals to choose their spouse, the absence of harmony, and make other personal decisions. Educational institution. The schools founded by the missionaries flourished and greatly increased in number by the mid-19th century. Education very quickly became the only route by which one's children could gain appointment to government jobs. Hence, this system of education was opposite to that of pre-colonial era, where education was handled by the extended family and the relatives. Consequently, parents, particularly those residing in the cities, were exceedingly eager to send their young ones to school. But going to school usually meant that children were actively exposed to European values, a fact which tended to widen the gap in value system of parents and children. Religious socialization. The missionaries who started schools in most parts of Africa were aware of the possibilities of religious socialization, which could be achieved through them. Although the state had taken over and secularized the schools in many places, religion often remains a part of the curriculum because Christian and Muslim parents want their children to have formal instructions in their faith. Governments also rely on the school to socialize their pupils into loyal and active citizens. For instance, singing the national anthem, saluting the flag, and greeting national and state leaders teach the pupils they are part of something larger than their local community. Hence, colonial education was often designed consciously or unconsciously, eager to teach students to accept the status quo or to assimilate them into the culture of metropolitan country. Abernethy, 1969, Nyerere, 1967, and Clignet, 1970. Political socialization. Levine, 1965, stresses the point on the latent role of education in political socialization during the colonial period. The role is the connection which is often made between the spread of higher education and the growth of African independent movements. For instance, young men reading philosophy, history, and literature found out about the political development of other peoples. This supports their views that people should run their own affairs rather than being dominated by outsiders. Education abroad provided opportunities to discuss these conclusions and possible actions with young men from other areas. Fully accepting the ideas of equality and democracy which were implicit in their academic training, they return home to find themselves denied employment which was given to less well-trained colonial officers. Thus, their education socialized them to certain views of society which they had to work to create. Healthcare services. During the colonial period, missionaries did the first medical work in Nigeria. Most medical missionaries were not doctors and nurses in the real sense. For instance, John M. Coquard, an ordained Catholic priest who had some medical instructions, built the first hospital in Nigeria outside Lagos in 1895 and was said to have performed remarkable medical and surgical work there. What was to develop later as the Nigerian medical services converged from a military background. It was not until 1890, however, that medically qualified men came to Nigeria under army auspices. By the first decade of the new century, that is, mid-19th century, there were small military hospitals in Lokoja, Zungeru, and Zaria. The services of these doctors was expressly for military men and their families. Faniran Odekunle, 1979. According to Faniran Odekunle, the first effort of the colonial administration towards providing health facilities took place in Lagos because Lagos was becoming a slum as a result of the process of socialization and urbanization going on in Nigeria at the time. During and immediately the periods following the First and Second World Wars, hospitals were built by the colonial government to handle epidemics that broke out among the civilians and the soldiers. Some of these hospitals were later converted into general hospitals. The colonial period was characterized by a need to create a healthy environment around the capital where most of the British were residing, rather than from the desire to accept total responsibility for social welfare reform. Social welfare systems in Nigeria, colonial period. Nigeria conceptualizes social welfare as an institution that addresses housing, education, health, welfare, labor and employment, prison, youth and sports. This is according to Nigeria Development Plan 1975 to 1980 through two divisions, the Division of Community and the Social Services. The development and growth of social welfare systems during the colonial period in Nigeria were identified by Jarrett, 1991, and Faniran Odekunle, 1978, as follows. 1. In 1929, the Colonial Development Fund was established to promote the social welfare systems of African states, including Sierra Leone and Nigeria. For instance, during the Second World War, an alarming growth in juvenile delinquency, prostitution, drug abuse, infant mortality rate, rural-urban migration, and the school dropout rate caused the colonial administration to make two primary recommendations. First, the social welfare systems of the largest companies were divided into two divisions: social welfare and rural development. The foci were the rights to good health, proper nutrition, education, housing, recreation, jobs and income, and the decentralization of social amenities. Second, in 1944, the Colonial Advisory Committee on Education issued a report on the importance of mass education and community development, especially in the rural areas. 2. During the colonial era in Nigeria, one could see the first attempts of dealing with special social problems in a planned basis by the government. However, missionary activity had not ceased. Missionaries could demonstrate that what they were doing was worthwhile, and their programs could qualify for financial assistance. Where 1999 therefore identified here important social welfare issues that were given adequate attention then. These were: A. Care of the physically disabled, the blind, and the deaf. B. Care of mentally imbalanced. And C. The development of environmental resources to help juvenile delinquents. 3. Many Nigerians had been disabled in the Second World War. Ordinance Number 13 of 1945 of the United Nations guaranteed them free medical services, including the provision of prosthetic devices whenever needed. But there were other Nigerians whose disabilities were not war-related. These were victims of leprosy, poliomyelitis, and other crippling diseases. These ones were usually forced by their circumstance to beg on the streets. The Disabled Persons Register was started in 1955 in the hope of finding jobs for the disabled, but this register was out of use after a few years. 4. It is, however, interesting to note that disabled and abandoned children received more attention during this period, that is, between 1945 and 1955, than did their adult counterparts. For instance, the first Cheshire home in the country was built in Ibadan by a charity organization, and within a few years, similar Cheshire homes sprang up in other parts of the country to take care of handicapped and abandoned children. For example, the problem of juvenile delinquency became acute after the wars, and there were not enough jobs for every job applicant. The young school leavers who, upon moving to the city and finding no jobs, joined the bodies of youth who supported their existence through pickpocketing and similar activities. In this situation, remand homes for juvenile delinquents were established in various parts of the country, particularly in the urbanized centers. 5. This period, that is 1910 to 1958, can be seen as the formative years of the Nigerian social welfare system. During this period, the welfare system had acquired some of the major characteristics which were to die hard in the 1960s and 1970s. Among these characteristics were: A. An emphasis on funding the provision of services through voluntary associations. B. The regionalization of social welfare activities and functions with minimal directives from national government. And C. A tendency for urban problems to dominate the social welfare scene, while the problems of the rural areas were relegated to the background. However, from the mid-1950s until independence, with the aid from various overseas agencies like the WHO, UNESCO, and others, many more of the social and health problems received attention, such as the blind, the deaf, prenatal and postnatal care, and so on. Study session summary. In this study session, we described the few institutions that make up social structure during the colonial organization of Nigeria. These institutions include family institution, educational institution, religious socialization, political socialization, and healthcare services. We discussed the development and growth of social welfare systems during the colonial period in Nigeria. We explained the important social welfare issues that were given adequate attention during the colonial period in Nigeria. There was an urgent need for social welfare services because of the problem of juvenile delinquency, unemployed school leavers, and pickpocketing in the cities and similar activities that became acute after the Second World War in Nigeria. End of study session 9. Thanks for listening.